The first topic is life skills, and the second topic is disability rights. Both of the topics, I need to place the lines on mute. Just hold on a second. If people can mute themselves, that will be helpful. We can hear some background noise. So I'm also very pleased to welcome our friends from the American India Foundation. So we're very honored to have several of them here today. And in particular, want to welcome Mr. Manish Kumar, Ms. Chandni from India, Ms. Nirmala Garimela, and Suchitra from here from Boston. And both of these topics which we are going to talk about today were actually developed in collaboration with AIF and as a part of this AIF fellowship program. So before we begin, I would actually like to request Mr. Manish Kumar to say a few words about why life skills and disability rights were very important to AIF. And actually it was Nirmala who was mentor for Pallavi, who had suggested that we talk to AIF, and she actually connected Vision Aid and AIF and got Pallavi talking to Manish, and we got introduced to this course. So thank you, Nirmala. So if Manish can say a few words about that, and then I'll request Chandni to actually say a few words about the AIF fellowship program and introduce Pallavi, and then we can get started. So I will be placing, once Pallavi's session begins, we'll place all the lines on mute. So Pallavi, you can unmute yourself before the session begins. And once the session ends, we estimate it'll take about 40 minutes. We will open up the lines for Q&A and discussion at the other end. So with that said, I will now request Manish to say a few words on behalf of AIF, introducing life skills, disability rights, and AIF's perspective on it. Manish, it's all yours.
Hello and namaste to everybody from India. So right now, actually, I just pray and hope all of you are staying safe in your homes and wherever you are. Take care of yourself. And it's a very appropriate opportunity and a time where all of us can spare a little more extra time to undertake enhancement of our knowledge, become more aware of certain things. And yes, the digital platforms like this, Zoom or any other formats are actually playing a very critical role in disseminating this information across the globe right now. So thank you, Vision Aid, for choosing these two topics, because these are for a person with disability and the disability community as such. These two are very essential elements of their very existence and sustenance. So talking about rights of persons with disabilities and life skills, American India Foundation, even through its various livelihood and skill development programs, has put tremendous amount of effort to integrate all of this into the skilling programs. So focusing on persons with disabilities, AIF has a very specific program which is called Ability-Based Livelihood Empowerment, that's ABLE. And this program focuses on the skilling and employability of persons with disabilities. And life skills and awareness of the rights of people with disabilities is a core component of this program. Now, why life skills? So life skills, it's not that only people with disabilities require life skills. It is needed by each and every one of us. It is the core, the core skills that any individual needs to have, because it adds value to the individual, which helps him or her to synergize with others in the community at various levels and also help them to perform individually. So it gives an individual a perspective to operate in. So these life skills are very, very essential for any individual to move ahead in life. And when we talk about training people with disabilities, or for that matter, anybody, any youth from the marginalized communities, these core skills are actually missing. We've found that they are missing, and this is very essential for any individual to start interacting with people, start interacting with the community around, take up a job, deliver on time, and those kind of things. So AIF has been laying adequate emphasis on life skills being part of the entire skill development program. And the life skills program is actually developed on the internationally, recognized 10 core life skills, which I think Pallavi will take us through in the course of the webinar today. So life skills are very, very individualistic. So when we talk about people with disabilities, more so people with severe disabilities, which visual disability is part of, people need people needs enough, something, a push from within, so that they can come out and they can express themselves. So more so people with disabilities who have been marginalized, who have not got exposure, who have not got opportunities, these life skills actually help them to build their confidence, come out and speak for themselves, because at the end of the day, we want people with disabilities to speak for themselves, become self-advocates, not remain dependent on somebody else to speak for them. And that is what is empowerment all about. So this is it's an empowering medium, it's an empowering tool that helps people with disabilities to move ahead in life. And when we talk about the rights of persons with disabilities, actually in India, the Rights of People with Disabilities Act 2016 actually has been a milestone, because it has laid the foundation for inclusion. It has laid the foundation for mainstreaming people with disabilities in various aspects of life. 21 forms of disabilities have been included within the ambit of the law, which actually in the previous version, it was only 7. So that itself shows that the law itself has taken cognizance of the various forms of disabilities and the various challenges that people with disabilities have been facing, and has taken into account all of that. So besides the 21 forms of disabilities, enough emphasis is also laid on the education, on employment, on training, on health, on social justice, on accessibility. Accessibility is, I would say, one of the strong pillars of this act, which has given very clear guidelines on what accessibility should be and how accessibility should be maintained in various aspects, not just physical infrastructure, but also in terms of communication, in terms of information technology, in terms of transportation. So it's a range of things where accessibility needs to be undertaken. And the guidelines are very, very clear. And I think it's for the Indian, the Indian community, the corporates, the government system to kind of follow up on the implementation of this act. So what is happening is, the act has been created in 2016 December. The rules have come in much later, but there are still a lot of people, especially people with disabilities and people working with the disability community. People are not aware about what this act actually talks about. So people need to be aware. So the information has to be disseminated. So a session like today is going to play a role in disseminating information about what this act is all about. And it's not that it's going to give you the information about the entire act, but at least the salient points, so that then people can go back and refer to the act. And there are various handbooks and manuals. And to that effect, AIF has also created a simple manual in English to help people like us who are not legal experts, people like us who are working in the social sector, people who are persons with disabilities, people who work with the disability community, to actually understand what is the scope of the act, what does the act imply, what is our role, what are our rights, and especially from a perspective of a person with disability, what is the right. So most of the people don't know that there are provisions for reservation in the schooling, in the education. There are reservation in the employment. There are penal provisions when there is discrimination that is happening against people with disabilities. So these are the information that people should know, and they must exercise their right as and when it is needed. So I think these are the two very critical points, two very important aspects in the journey of a person with disability that Vision Aid has picked up. And I'm happy that AIF has been able to play a catalytic role in making this happen. And I would like to thank the entire Vision Aid team, and especially Pallavi Deshpande, who has worked on kind of aligning the curricula, the life skills curricula made by AIF to suit the training of people with visual disabilities, and then the perspectives on the RPWD Act. So I think that's it from my side, and over to Pallavi and the others. Thank you.
Ram, I think you're on mute.
You're
I think I want to hit unmute. Yeah.
Oh, so sorry. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Funny how that mute button works. But thank you so much, Manish. That was an excellent overview of the two topics, and you set the context perfectly. Couldn't have asked for better. So thank you for providing that great overview. I'd like to request Chandni to now just briefly introduce the AIF Fellowship Program and to introduce our speaker, Pallavi, and then we can get started.
Sure. Thank you, Ram. Again, I would like to begin by echoing Manish's words and thanking VisionAid for taking, this opportunity to disseminate information on the area of life skills, disabilities, and maximizing on the virtual platform, which has also become such a vital part of the new normal that we have slowly started to embrace. So thank you for taking this up and giving our fellow Pallavi an opportunity to, share her insights and experience from the fellowship journey of the last 10 months on this platform. Those of you who might not know about the program under which Pallavi has been operating under VisionAid right now, the Clinton Fellowship Program under the American India Foundation is an immersive 10-month volunteer service program where we recruit fellows in part from India and in part from the US, and we deploy them within civil society organizations in India for a period of 10 months, where they contribute to sustainable and scalable projects, primarily in the areas of public health, education, and livelihoods. Pallavi happens to be a fellow of class 1920. She is currently serving as a fellow at VisionAid Visakhapatnam. She graduated from Claremont McKenna College with a degree in economics. At VisionAid, she has been working with the VisionAid Online Academy to develop the platform and has designed 2 courses, Life Skills and Rights of Persons with Disabilities, during her time at the organization. I do know that Pallavi has gone over and beyond what the project at VisionAid requires her to do, and she has led to her interest shaping a number of other opportunities that she's taken advantage of. As the 10 months of service now nearly come to an end, in fact, the cohort is in the middle of celebrating the end point, which marks the graduation ceremony for the cohort. I am very excited to hear from Pallavi about her experience of having worked with VisionAid and all that she wants to share with us on the subjects that we are looking to cover in today's webinar. With this said, I would like to invite Pallavi to jump on board next and share her insights with us.
Thank you so much for the excellent introduction, Chandni. Really appreciate that. And with that, we will hand it off to Pallavi. Pallavi, take it away.
Perfect. So hi, everybody. And thank you so much for all the India people who've tuned in at 7:30 in the morning, and even the US people who've tuned in pretty late at night if you're on EST time zone. So first of all, I want to thank Manish. Thank you for answering my phone calls and giving me advice, to answering my last minute emails. And thank you, Chandni, for being you. I was nervous about the webinar. I was like, okay, I have to talk about everything I've done in the past 10 months, but just having a familiar face, all my supporters from VisionAid and AIF coming together and celebrating sort of, what I've been able to do over the past 10 months is really, really just cool. So first of all, thank you. And just wanted to echo what Manish said. I know this is a really troubling time, so I hope you all are safe and sound and just supporting yourselves and your communities in the best way possible for you. So with that, I'll say let's jump in. But before we jump in, because we are a limited group, and I love that, I love small group discussions. So I want to keep this talk as informal as possible, especially when we talk about something like rights of persons with disabilities and life skills. I do think that me going into extreme technical detail about how I've designed these courses or what aspects I've chosen to talk about might or might not sit with you 30, 40 minutes after the talk. But what I really, really want to emphasize, and if there is one thing I want you to take away from this talk, is understanding that there is a Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act, that there is something called life skills, and this is something that is very relevant to the disability sector. I will be talking about it specifically from the perspective of working with visually impaired, but as Manish said, you know, these are skills that need to be applied and extrapolated to the larger community. And I would argue that not just the people with disabilities, allies, advocates, people who are actively working in the disability space need to be aware of the resources that are available to them to empower the communities further. So again, wanted to reinforce this very informal talk. If you have any questions, don't wait until the end. Please just keep popping them in the chat below. Just feel free to raise your hand at any point. So that's how I wanted to start off, and that's what I wanted to start off with. So rights of persons with disabilities and life skills. Ram, can you go to the next slide? Also, for those who weren't here, we have a slight mishap where it's storming in Hyderabad, so I don't have power necessarily. So Ram's my he is helping me do my presentation today. So thank you for that, Ram. And I just wanted to go over the brief agenda for today. So what I will be talking about is rights of persons with disabilities, just going over what the act is, why it's important to think about it, just some additional resources in case you want to go above and beyond what I've talked about here. And once we've set that scene up, then I'll sort of talk about life skills. I'll talk about life skills as an important topic in itself, but also how VisionAid has adapted it into a course and how I was able to implement it for the first time. I did a 7-day life skills workshop with the first batch of the scholar training program students. And these are scholarship program students who came to the Vizag Center, the Visakhapatnam Center, and they underwent this life skills workshops. That I will be talking more about that as well. And I want to wrap this up by talking more about how we talk about disability and sort of asking some questions that have been plaguing me based on my experience with VisionAid over the past 10 months and something that has really excited me about working in this space. So that's a brief overview of how this webinar is going to go. And Ram, can you move to the next slide? So when we talk about rights of persons with disabilities, so before jumping into specific rights or before even jumping into the legal matter of what the act contains, I just want everybody to take 30 seconds to think about this word rights. Think about it as you as a human being, who has signed an unsaid social contract with the society that you're a part of, and rights as something that enables you to live a secure life and be comfortable where you are. So I just want you to think about what this word rights means. I think we implicitly assume that everybody has access to rights, but I really want to question that idea and that theoretical framework in this webinar. So, take 30 seconds, and then after that, I'm going to show you a video, and then I'll give you sort of my take on why I think rights for the visually impaired and specifically persons with disabilities becomes all the more important. So yeah, so just take a couple of seconds. I actually want you to think about this. I hope that, I know that's not much time, but I hope I've at least given you enough time to orient yourself for the answer and, think about that more as, Ram, in the next slide, there'll be a link to the YouTube video. I usually don't like YouTube videos that generalize specific aspects of disability just because it's just such a diverse lived experience. But I think this video does a very good experience talking about investment. And remember the word rights, investment, and life outcomes. And then, let's watch this video, and then I can share a little bit more about what I felt about it.
Okay, give me a second.
Yeah.
I will have to open. Actually, I'm only sharing the PowerPoint, so actually give me a second. I just
yeah, no worries at all.
Have to stop sharing the screen and Okay, can you see the video?
Yeah, I can see this. Yeah.
Okay, let me play it. Hopefully the audio will work.
Once upon a time, there were two girls. They were just like you and me. The first girl was born to a mother who loved her, a mother who made sure she was healthy and strong.
A mother takes her baby to a clinic where she receives a vaccination.
And who was lucky enough to have access to clean water. When it was time, she went to school with her brother,
A young girl on a toilet and going to school with her brother.
where she was able to learn in a safe environment, form friendships that last a lifetime, and realize her dreams.
A young girl growing up with her friends and then graduating from high school. She graduates and becomes a doctor.
The second girl was born to a mother who loved her too.
A mother carrying her baby steps on a landmine.
But her mother was taken away, and her future was changed. Instead of receiving love and care, she was hidden away.
A young girl without legs watches her family eat through a keyhole.
She was the last to be fed, and the last to get clean water.
She uses a bucket for a toilet.
While others went to school, she stayed at home.
Her brother goes to school and leaves her at home.
She became vulnerable to neglect, violence, abuse, and exploitation.
She is teased at school.
Her society wasn't inclusive, and now she's on the fringes of it.
Now a young woman, she begs in the streets.
But hold on a moment. What if, instead of abandoning that girl, we invested in her?
The mother steps on a landmine, but the baby survives and is fitted with a wheelchair.
What if we said no to stigma and discrimination?
As a young girl, she eats with her family at the table.
What if we cost-effectively gave her access to water, sanitation, and hygiene? And made sure she could attend the same school as her peers without disabilities.
She uses an accessible toilet and speaks with her friends at school. She graduates and becomes a doctor.
Well, I'd call that a good investment. Because the cost of exclusion is higher than the cost of inclusion. Let's build an inclusive society together.
Invest in children. UNICEF.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, so
Yeah.
give me
So
a
then, yeah,
give me
no
a second.
worries.
I'm going to bring up your slides and then you can get started again.
Perfect.
Okay, is this where we should be?
Yeah, this is exactly where we should be.
Okay.
So one of the reasons I wanted to show you this video before we jumped into the nitty gritty was because I wanted you to start thinking about what rights can do, right? So before I showed you this video, I asked you a couple of questions, or I asked you to think about what rights can mean. And for example, I can talk about it from a personal perspective. I don't want to generalize. Like, I think I have assumed that I have the right to X, Y, and Z, right? You know, when I don't have access to water, I'm like, what happened to the for example, electricity today, right? I was so angry that the electricity and the power is gone because I'm supposed to have electricity and I'm supposed to have access. And I'm trivializing here, but I think there's a very strong point to be made about we implicitly assume certain accesses that are given to us by society by virtue of who we are, where we belong to, what society we're a part of, right? And I do think it brings society together. There's a social contract between you and the government where the government acknowledges you as citizens of a society and you acknowledge the government as someone who's going to take care of you and address your day-to-day needs. Now, without those rights, you can probably be marginalized and be on the side and feel like you don't belong to a society where the rights that the larger majority shares is something you're actively excluded from, right? So when we start thinking about rights, I want you to start thinking about this as a way of belonging, as a way of reintegrating people with disabilities into the mainstream society again. So let's not create multiple societies. I think one of the crucial elements of this right is inclusivity. Inclusivity in the real sense of let's create one society where we live, not multiple, where, yeah, we have assistance and accommodation, but it's not true inclusion almost, right? So Ram, can you move to the next slide? Perfect. So when I was looking at this video, there were a couple of things that stood out to me. First of all, shout out to UNICEF for including universal design, because if you notice, not only was there print on the video, but there was someone actively signing what was going on the video, but also there was an audio description for the visually impaired for the times where they just had a picture and no voice. So they were actually explaining what was going on in the video. So, I mean, I think it's the small steps that matter, you know, starting off with universal design and everything we do is one step. But coming back to the video itself, what I really liked was this idea of investment. And all too often when we think about rights, we think about investing in infrastructure, investing in specific institutions. But I think we should sort of boil it down to who the final beneficiary is. And why don't we invest in human beings, right? Why don't we invest in a model that empowers the human being? So I think that's what the rights-based approach to disability has been. Let's incorporate rights. Let's normalize access to rights. Let's make rights a widespread phenomenon in communities where people face disabilities. And the end result will be that they will be incorporated into mainstream society in very tangible and real ways. So I really like thinking about investment in terms of human potential. And I really think that video did a good job showing you that, even though of course it was a very happy video. And I hope that turns out, that's the case for almost everybody. But before we move on to the next portion, I want everybody to ask yourself this question. Because I get a lot of questions about, when I was talking about this act specifically and having to restructure existing buildings according to accessibility standards, a lot of people ask me, the first question is, oh my God, don't you think it's going to take a lot of money to sort of redesign your entire building, make it accessible? And the only question that stuck with me over these 10 months is, do you really want to live in a society where your comfort and access actively takes away from another community? I think around the world, we're grappling with similar questions. And I really want to bring this focus also on the communities of the visually impaired, of people with disabilities. What is the cost of our own comfort, something that we're used to, right? And how we need to start dismantling those notions to truly build accessibility into everything we do. So that's sort of how I wanted to start rights of persons with disabilities and talk about why I think this is such an important topic to talk about. So we can jump right into the right itself now. Ram, can you move to the next slide? Perfect. So I just wanted to tell people that even though the right today, as of 2016, is something that's been passed, the struggle has been going on for decades. This started in the early 70s, but this started in the form of various activists and NGOs in specific disability types. So you had people with locomotor disabilities asking and fighting for their rights on one hand, and then you had the visually impaired saying, you know, we want access to Braille, we want access to screen readers, but there wasn't really a pan disability movement that had still taken off. But, you know, slowly in the 70s, activists started realizing that to actually bring about widespread sweeping policy change, you need to actually start working together. And that's what the 80s saw. That's what the 80s saw. In the 80s, a lot of these demands were consolidated, protests, petitions, forced the government to actually think about this concretely. And that resulted in the 1995 Act, the Equal Opportunities Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act. And that's a mouthful to say. But so that's what came out of it. One of the key highlights of the bill was sort of increasing reservation for people with disabilities, but it was limited in its scope and it really didn't have teeth to the law. So people were still sort of dissatisfied with the way things were going, and the struggle was on. And in 2006, India became a signatory and ratified the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Apologies, these are very long names. But basically what that means is when a country signs and ratifies something, that means internally within the country, it is agreed to pass legislation that acts on the key provisions provided in this convention. And this sort of convention was built on this idea of equality, inclusion, and inclusion not at a surface level, but true inclusion into mainstream society. One example I'll give you is, you know, if you don't want your visually impaired child to only go to school with other visually impaired students, of course that's your choice. And if that's what you're comfortable doing, by all means. But what if the nearby school that was accessible, that you felt comfortable and safe sending your child to wasn't specifically a blind school. And the principal said, no, we cannot admit you because this is not a blind school. We don't have the equipment or the resources to sort of take your kid in. According to the Act today, 2016, that would constitute discrimination, right? And you can actually legally bring that to the notice of the state commissioner, district commissioner, and actually take action against that. But so basically that was the idea of the convention, to really, really talk about inclusion as bringing everybody together and making inclusion something that's just not necessary for specific institutions, but mandated across the board. So then another bill was introduced and people worked on it. And finally in 2016, the Milestone Act was passed. And as Manish said, this was a milestone because finally this had teeth. From fines and penalties, people could actually be punished for discriminating against people with disabilities. And when you have something like that, I think people actually pay attention and people stop to make sure that their actions are in line with, honestly, I would say, being a good human being, but also within the purview of the law, right? So that's the context behind how this act was passed and what sort of this act encompasses. And again, exactly as Manish said, I'm not a lawyer. So my key point in even delivering this webinar is at the end of the day, this is the one thing I want you to take away. And I'm going to repeat this. I said this even in the beginning. I don't care if you realize that there's the 4% reservation or 5% reservation. What I want you to know is that there are actual rights and resources available for people with disabilities and allies to reach out to as and when needed, right? So that's sort of where we're coming from in terms of this act. So Ram, you can move to the next tab, next tab. Perfect. So these are some of the key highlights, and this is something this is a list I came up with after the partner training program. So we had a training program where VisionAid's partners came to VisionAid and we sort of walked them through some of the new initiatives that VisionAid is taking, some of the new courses that had been designed, and rights of persons with disabilities was one of this. And I sat them down and, we were walking through various sections of the act and bill. And they were like, okay, no, that's interesting. No, this is interesting. So I made a mental note of that and I've tried to condense it down to some of the key highlights. And as Manish said, now over 21 disabilities are officially recognized, 22 if you include any category. So this is an interesting addition. If you believe that you have a disability that hasn't been covered in the 21 disabilities, you can actually petition and based on certain documentation. And the way this act defines disability is by barriers. So if you can prove that there's enough barriers to your day-to-day activities and functionings, the government can actually recognize your condition as a disability, right? And here I would want to make a very important categorization. So this is also very, very important to remember when you're thinking about this act. There are different categorizations of disability. So there's something called benchmark disability. So this is what you really need to remember. Benchmark disability means you have about a 40% disability. And there's some measurable disabilities, some non-measurable disabilities, but there's something called a certifying authority. And these are usually the government hospitals and practitioners that you've been undergoing your treatment with. So essentially, if anybody has a benchmark disability that is 40% and above, they are eligible for government subsidies, loans, scholarships, resources, etc., etc. And low vision and blindness is a benchmark disability. And blindness specifically definitely is a benchmark disability. So this is something you really need to keep in mind. And there's another kind called high support needs. So this is people with extreme disability and how they've categorized it, or how it helps to think about this as 70 to 80% and above. These are people who depend on either specific technology or people or guardians to continue living their lives according to their own wishes, right? So these are the two categories that the government has laid out in this act. And then high support needs have their own extra resources that they have acknowledged. And another point that I haven't mentioned here, but I think is very interesting, is that women and children have finally been outlined as vulnerable groups. That is, again, I think it's extremely intersectional disability. It's not just impacted by the disability, but you as who you are, your identity. So they have gone above and beyond and they've said, women and children constitute vulnerable groups. So they have special protections and resources afforded to them under this act. So that's sort of the different categories under disabilities. And another thing that's interesting is the reservation quota, and this is specifically for jobs. So every government job will now have 4% of their seats reserved for people with disabilities, right? And again, in the same vein, I think one of the biggest thrusts of this act has been on non-discrimination and right to equality. And non-discrimination and equality, how they've defined it, of course, depends on what we're looking at. For education, it means, if Rekha wants to go to X school in her neighborhood, Rekha has the right to go to X school in the neighborhood. So it's really focusing on individual choice. So that's sort of what they mean by non-discrimination. Within employment, you cannot discriminate based on someone's disability. That is, for example, if Krishna requires a screen reader to perform day-to-day tasks and the office says, oh no, we cannot, or we will not, that actually officially constitutes discrimination in this case, right? And again, I already spoke a little about inclusive education, but I think what's amazing or what has really given me hope is this idea that all education for people with benchmark disabilities, that is again 40% and above, will be free. And it's not just the cost of you going to school, it's your books, it's material, it's transportation, all of that can also be covered under this idea of inclusive education and helping people with disabilities up until the age of 18 get education that they want to get. And even within higher institutions, there is reservation within government schools. I think it's up until 5% of the seats are reserved for people with disabilities. So that's really, these are some of the most salient facts that I thought were relevant to share with you in terms of immediate application. If there's someone you can think of, if you can share this with people in your own circle, I think it's really interesting to talk about. And another thing that I really want to mention is Javed Abidi. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. I think anybody who's made any manual on the Rights of Persons with Disability Act knows him. So he recently passed away, but he was a pioneer of the disability rights movement. And he said something interesting for me. He was like, a law is theoretically only a law on paper. It really becomes a law that people embody and become used to once you start disseminating it. And in India, the statistic still holds true. 3 out of 4 visually impaired. And again, I'm here specifically referring to visually impaired, but you can also extrapolate a very similar statistic to persons with disabilities across India. So 3 out of 4 visually impaired live in rural areas, right? And in rural areas without adequate access to information, either about this act or in general about disability rights and the movement, can leave them extremely stunted. And they are the primary stakeholders in this act, right? They're the people who will benefit the most. Keeping them out of the information loop, either because they aren't able to access it or because it's too hard to understand. I mean, how many of us engage with laws and amendments on a day-to-day basis unless it's our profession? So I think one of the key moves that Vision Aid really wants to take is normalizing it, condensing it, and delivering it in a way that's easy to understand. So, he really inspired me to not even go into some of the legal details here. I just want to talk to you about, let's talk about inclusive education, because why not, right? And that's what has influenced my philosophy, even working with Vision Aid in the past couple of months. So Ram, you can move on to the next slide. Again, this is inclusive education. I really like the emphasis on that choice, because I do think a lot of models of disability that either relegate the visually impaired to specific blind schools or specific schools that might be far off. I mean, think about it. Your child is in 5th grade. How safe do you feel sending your kid to a school that's an hour away versus a neighborhood school that hasn't been relegated as a blind school, or a school that has traditionally admitted students with visual impairments, right? So I really like this thrust on your choice. If you choose, you should be able to send your kid to any school. And now the onus is put on these institutions by the government, and of course the government itself, to build campuses where training and material is accessible to everybody. So for example, I use the example of Rekha. She's a low vision student and she wants to attend a neighborhood school. So for low vision, let's say she wants a magnifier, right? So they cannot turn her down based on this one request. That would be discrimination. She would be provided with a magnifier. She would be provided with resources and communication material in a format that best fits her needs. So that's what I really like about inclusive education. And there's 2 other things that I want to make a note of. There's increasing capacity of human resources and increasing logistical capacities. Because most often we think of, okay, I'll give you the screen reader, I'll give you a magnifier, and I think you should be fine, right? So I think it's also important to understand that it's the teachers. There is a human element to education today. training the teachers in how to deliver content in a way that's based on universal design. That is, regardless of your senses and abilities, you should be able to access it and learn and grow, right? So that's what I really liked about some of the courses that Vision 8 has been developing, whether it be rights of persons with disabilities, their computer training course. It really focuses on building capacity of human resources. Because the more teachers we train and the more teachers are trained in this idea of universal design as it pertains to education, the wider will be the impact in terms of how many people they in turn can affect, right? So I think that's really powerful. So Ram, you can move to the next slide. Perfect. I mean, so I would say skilling is the first step, but the last step that every visually impaired student that I have personally met says, this is helpful, but I really need a job to stand on my 2 feet. You know, what's the point of me going through all these trainings if there aren't employers willing to employ me? So I think this is a crucial element of this act, just as it pertains to what the visually impaired students have told me matters to them, right? So as I said before, this act prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of disability. Nobody can, for example, nobody can deny you a promotion because you're visually impaired. Nobody can deny you reasonable accommodation. Now, this is a very interesting term, and the legal definition of it matters, and I don't want to go into specifics about it, but if the organization can provide you with that resource, in this case, say screen readers, without undue burden. And here NVDA is a screen reader. Again, screen readers are something, you know, when we read text, we read the text using sight, but screen readers relay everything that's on the screen via audio. So for example, that, right? NVDA is free. So, I mean, there really isn't that much of an argument about, oh, it's undue burden either financially, logistically. So they cannot discriminate on the basis of that. Again, 1% of all government posts are reserved specifically for vision impaired students, and 5% of all higher education seats are reserved for people with benchmark disabilities. Now, again, I think it's really important to remember that a lot of these provisions simply apply to people with benchmark disabilities. So they remember 40% and above, and that's why you can hear a lot of people saying, you know, I need that disability certificate that specifies that I have a benchmark disability, right? And again, another for employment. Oh yes, thank you, Manish. 4% overall. So 1% is for people with visual impairment, and 4% overall for persons with disabilities. There's a reservation, right? Another, like the last two important points that I want to cover before we move on to the next slide is vocational trainings are accessible to people with disabilities. I see these amazing webinars, these amazing training. You know, I think I recently took one about how to craft emails, because that's something we all really have to do every day and suffer doing. And that was completely inaccessible. You know, I think having worked with Vision 8 for a while, every website I see, I'm like, okay, there's no color contrast there. The accessibility to this website is abysmal. So I realized that even this webinar that I was a part of was terrible at being accessible to people with visual impairment, for example. So, you know, I really like the thrust in this act that vocational trainings must be made accessible, right, to everybody. Yes, for people with disabilities. So I think that'll be even more helpful in enhancing their growth outside the classroom. And there will be there has to be a grievance redressal officer. These are, you know, this is a person, if something happens to you, if you do feel like you're being discriminated against, or you're not getting your due, you can reach out to the grievance redressal officer, and then you can take that forward. So I just wanted to put that out there, that organizations and establishments and institutions are supposed to have these. And when I say establishment, it also includes private institutions. It's not any recognized establishment, right? So that's an important nuance I would like to add. And Ram, we can move on to the next slide. Accessibility, again, Manish said this is a huge thing. I mean, I'll give you a good example. I'll just give you one example from the scholars that I interacted with, who had to quit his job and just quit. A lot of what he found gave meaning to his life, because he recently had lost his sight at the age of 50, and he just could not access public transport. The buses they didn't have audio signal, so he really had to rely on someone else to tell him when the bus was coming, what bus was coming. He couldn't drive on his own, and he had to rely on his friends to take him to work. So these are some very, very simplistic examples, but you know, we take access for granted in a lot of fronts, whether it's public transport, whether it's having pavements on the roads and having clear demarcation between the road where the vehicles drive versus where you walk. And these are small examples, right? So through this act, the government has laid down standards, and not just physical infrastructure. They also talk about information technology and communication, where they say, you know, specific services need to be accessible to all. It's not just that you build a building, it's also the material and the emails that you send be accessible. And they've given a timeline, and as Manish said, there have been certain amendments and there have been certain rules that have come out a lot later. But as of now, again, Manish, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the timeline to make buildings accessible is 2020. That is, all existing buildings need to be made accessible, and buildings that are being built from scratch have to adhere by law to the standards, to the accessibility standards set within the law. Again, I love universal design. I promote it, even if you're completely working in a sector that's not related to disability. I think universal design is something we just need to normalize. Like, oh, I need to make things look pretty, or I want to make this PowerPoint aesthetically pretty. I want to make this PowerPoint universally accessible and be based on the principles of universal design. So I think that's something that's incredibly important. And to those who, I mean, I'll just give you a quick refresher. Universal design is, regardless of your ability, you should be able to access it. And that can be from color contrast to to your document being accessible to a screen reader, through having an audio file, et cetera, right? So these are some of the points within accessibility that I think were relevant. And Ram, you can move on to the next slide. Perfect. So I have walked you through some of, what I wanted to do was raise awareness about a lot of these issues and actually tell you concrete resources that are available in case you need to reach out and use them. But if you actually want to access resources in even more detail, there is, as Manish pointed out, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities manual published by American India Foundation, but there's also a Hans Foundation handbook on rights of persons with disabilities. Both of these do a really good job of, I think, going into very important specific detail, whether it be about, you know, this, and this, am I eligible? Or like this, and this, does this count as discrimination? I think they do a good job of elaborating various scenarios where this might be applicable. So definitely check that out. Again, this was my backup presentation. I promise in the one that's uploaded, I'll add many more resources, including audiovisual resources as well. So this is what I had for rights of persons with disabilities. You know, this is something that's always evolving. I'm sure new rights, new amendments will continuously be added, but I just hope at the end of my long lecture, or so it seems, you guys are at least inspired to take a look at what's out there and think about rights as something and not take rights for granted, actually, I would say, to actually think of ways in which communities that have been marginalized and denied access from rights that we take for granted each and every day are given to them, and given to them in a way in which they can empower themselves to live the lives that they desire. So that's something I wanted to end Rights of Persons with Disabilities with. Again, please keep your questions coming if you have any. If not, that's totally fine too. We'll move on to life skills now. So I really have to thank Nirmala for actually both. So I was having my unofficial debrief with Nirmala, and I was talking to her about how specific elements within the scholar training program are going. Again, this was a 6-month fully funded residential scholarship program, multidisciplinary approach, holistic approach to education. Quite incredible if you don't know. So here VisionAid taught scholars everything from mobility and orientation all the way up until computer training. So this is where I came into VisionAid. You know, this was my first experience with some of the ground level work that they were doing. And, you know, me and Ram had a lot of conversations about how we can get specific ideas rolling. This was when we had started sort of talking about what my role in VisionAid would be. And I was realizing more and more that education for so many people in India, whether it is by habit, whether it is, you know, by something that they've internalized, has become synonymous with technical skill development. And I think that's important. Again, I'm not denying that. But I think education is so much more than what you learn in a classroom, right? Education happens all around us. We observe and we learn. We have feelings and we have to navigate tough situations. I mean, I'm not plugging anything here, but when I lost power today, I honestly thought I freaked out for a second. And navigating situations where you're put in challenging positions, I think, is also a life skill that is so much more important than me knowing how to make a PPT. Again, I'm not comparing, but I'm also sort of putting the importance of life skills out there. Life skills teaches you how to live, but also teaches you how to learn. So without teaching people how to learn, I think it's funny that we jump into teaching and we get frustrated when our teachings don't work out the way we want them to. So I think a lot of the thrust for life skills for me has been sort of focusing on helping them sit with their own feelings, being more self-aware and navigating the personal lives, but all, and in personal lives, I would say how to navigate personal and challenging situations, but also work in teams, be able to effectively communicate what you want to say, like ask questions when you're unclear, take a statement and break it down critically. So this is sort of the overview of why life skills came into being, or why why the idea germinated in Nirmala. I was like, this is great, you should do it. And Ram was like, yeah, please, this is fantastic. And, with their support and mentorship, we came up with a course, which I think is accessible now or will be soon on the Vision Aid online academy portal. But Ram, you can move on to the next slide. So I know life skills is a very vague term. It's, people throw it around like diversity or intersectionality. It becomes very, very important to talk about what this means and what we mean by life skills. So I'm using the World Health Organization definition here. I'll just read it out. It's the abilities for adaptive and positive behavior that enable individuals to deal effectively with the demands and challenges of everyday life. And exactly as Manish pointed out, life skills isn't something that's specifically for the visually impaired or specifically for people with disabilities. There are days where I feel like I wish I'd taken a course in life skills, So this is the perspective that we're coming from for life skills. And Ram, you can move on to the next slide. So the way I want to do this is, because life skills is such a broad topic with hundreds of subtopics, I'll talk about how I went about structuring this course that Vision Aid that I've structured this course with Vision Aid. So there are 4 modules, and I will walk you through each and every module, and I'll talk about how I've delivered this module and sort of the feedback I've gotten, because I've already tried one iteration of it. So the first one is empathy. Again, I'm sure all of you know what empathy is, but just because I feel like it's helpful, empathy is imagining one's life from another person's perspective. It's different from sympathy, and I think that's something we really, really emphasize on for the scholars. Again, why is empathy important? Because can we really truly build meaningful relationships if we don't empathize with the other person? Can we build a diversity of perspectives and accept a diversity if we're not empathetic? I don't know, I personally don't think we can, but I mean, ask yourselves that question. So I'll give you an example of one activity, and every single workshop and every single module is only activities. I truly think lecturing someone about empathy is quite ineffective in getting them to understand what empathy is. So I'll take you through one activity, is treating others respectfully, right? And it's this idea that you want others to treat you like you would want to treat yourself. So it's really, that was the motivation, and we broke people into teams. And what we did was we asked them to, and how I phrased this was, think about respect that you already practice now, whether it be touching someone's feet, calling someone ma'am. And again, respect is it's very ingrained in the culture and place you come from. So this might differ for various people, and that's fine, right? But this idea of respect can extend beyond human beings is something that also we explored in this workshop. So for example, one group had to come up with 3 innovative ways in which they respect the environment. And the scholars did really surprise me. They came up with pretty cool ones, all the way from using Rapido and not private transportation to littering and using limited water and not wasting water. They had very specific examples, of course, but that was something we did. And one of the things that we focus on in these kind of activities is that I don't need a board or a computer, and these are activities that can happen just with a group of students anywhere. So the purpose of this was to really reinforce this idea that it's not just that people treat you nicely, you also treat them back nicely. And this 2-way communication is extremely important to building lasting communications, especially, I've noticed for people with visual impairment, I don't think they've had access, because of the stigma, lack of access to outside interactions where they've had that ability and opportunity to interact and grow from these interactions. So I think having such activities and making them think critically about ways in which they can treat others and in turn expect to be treated, I think was very helpful. So that was what we did for empathy. That's one example. We had 3 or 4 activities. Ram, you can go to the next slide. Effective communication. I think each and every one of us on this call, knows the importance of effective communication, whether it's from sending that good email to communicating with your supervisor about what you want to get done, or just building relationships at home. I can think of so many instances at home with my own parents where, there's a mismatch or misunderstanding and then things blow up. So effective communication pervades every aspect of our life. So it's when we're talking about people with visual impairment, I think it's important because they have one of the strongest tools that they have is verbal communication, right? Because a lot of nonverbal communication is body language, head nodding, pitch, the way you're presenting yourself, and that's sort of inaccessible to them. So one of the activities we really focus on was how do you hone in on your verbal communication and make that your strength. But the activity I want to discuss with you guys today is an activity called enhancing nonverbal communication, because a lot of statistics say that about 80% of our day-to-day communication is nonverbal, right? And this is something I have thought a lot about, and I actually have pinpointed instances in my own head where I guess my facial expression or the way I say things matters or has an implicit undertone than the things I'm saying myself. So one of the activities that we actually came up with was head to toe listening. So we oriented the students with, when you're talking to someone or when you're at a restaurant or when you're at a job interview, the setting we chose was a job interview, was you have your head oriented towards the sound or the speaker. Don't flap your arms, keep your arms relaxed. So we broke down the body into specific segments and we sort of gave advice about how to orient each segment. And we had role play exercises where the instructors were, I'm the interviewer, you come to me, and how do you orient yourself right from when you enter the room to talk to me. And I do want to address that there is this monopoly and power imbalance, because me as a sighted person expects that the visually impaired person match up to my idea of etiquette and networking and professionalism, which I have a lot of thoughts about. And I think this is something I would love to discuss after the presentation, because I don't think I left time for it in the official structure. But I do have to say, we have a monopoly over professionalism, and that also breaking that is a part of building an inclusive environment. So I just want to hint something that I care about and I'm really passionate about, and we can talk about that more if anyone else is interested. So that's what I had for effective communication. So yes, verbal communication, but also thrust on nonverbal. And yeah, Ram, you can move to the next slide. Interpersonal relationships, no man is an island. Think about what brings you happiness, whether it's going back to your family, meeting your friends, working in an office where you're actually very comfortable and love the people you work with. We are all a product of the interactions we have. And I do think focusing on building and meaningful relationships in a sustainable way is crucial to mental well-being, social well-being, and interacting and participating productively in society. So one of the activities that we came up with this was I Can Appreciate. And the reason we came up with this was I noticed that a lot of the times the students wanted to give answers, but they were like, no, I want to give the answer. And it was very seldom that they worked in teams to address a problem. And I do think almost everything we do today is a team effort, right? So it was really imbuing the students with a sense of teamwork, importance of it, and also appreciation for it. So I Can Appreciate is literally where we team people off and they stare at each other, or they look at each other, they face each other. And one of the things that they're doing is, of course, practicing the nonverbal communication body language technique, but also saying, I appreciate this about you. And an example I'll give is something that a student said is, I appreciate the fact that you go above and beyond to make sure that I've eaten my lunch every day. It can be as simple as that, And the scholar training program was a pretty small program. So the students were a tight-knit community towards the end of it. And these are the small things students remembered. And when you vocalize it, you legitimize the appreciation, and it just becomes such a beautiful thing to just observe. When I was sitting there and hearing all the appreciations, it was just incredible seeing them come together. And then we sort of tied that up into bigger themes of teamwork. So that was interpersonal relationships. Ram, next one. So I think this is another important life skill that I think I think saying it's important is an understatement, right? I think how we approach the way we learn, from the way we talk to the way we interact and the way we think, is underpinned by certain assumptions, thinking frameworks, and and it's also a question of how we have come to, I guess, embrace these frameworks and learn these. So for a lot of the visually impaired students who, I'm speaking from a very specific sample size, of course, not generalizing, But when you go through a very specific education regime that focuses on, test, results, pass, critical thinking becomes a very important skill to learn. So the activity that I focused on, it's called something very generic, thinking analytically, but it was very interesting because we paired students up in groups of 2 or 3, and I gave them a statement. And the statement in this case was, today most of the young people are afraid of talking to their parents about career options. Do you think people should be allowed to choose their own career options? How would you interact with your parent if they forced a career option on you? Right? And this was something that was relatable to all of them to a certain degree, also because they were older students who had gone through the own process of picking a specific subject, sticking with it and graduating in that subject. So what they did was we walked through how you would take a sentence and break it up based on assumption, what's fact, what's opinion, how do you distinguish between the two, how do you start thinking about your own opinions about what, when, how, why, these fundamental questions that sort of guide how we break down any problem and how we approach analyzing a problem. So we walked students through all of that, and they came up with their own opinions, and they came up with their own sort of 30-second, 1-minute speeches about why they thought what they thought. That was cool. So that was critical thinking. Run next slide. So these are some of the students. So this was also one thing I want to note is every picture included here is with the consent of the people who are featured in the picture. So I have spoken to them and they said it was okay for me to feature this specific picture of them in this webinar. So this was how we set up sort of the life skills workshop. They just sat in a group and we just spoke. And one of the things that was interesting was, you have to raise your hand every single time you have a thought. And so this is just like helping you visualize what it looked like on the ground. So that's a picture from a day-to-day. And with this, I want to conclude sort of the life skills course. So this is the course that, we've developed and people can take, and it's a 7-day course. And it's sort of these intense workshops with activities that provide a safe space for reflection and growth and change. And we went back and forth with feedback. Students wanted to spend more time on critical thinking, so we spent an extra day doing that. So it's a very flexible, dynamic sort of course. And, so that's what I've had a great time developing it. But now I want to wrap up by thinking about this idea of disability, right? How we talk about disability is so important. And I remember Manish's presentation from orientation, and he said language matters. And in that moment, yes, I was like, of course, language matters, how we talk about disability, whether you say someone's mute, deaf, dumb, and these are some of the adjectives I've heard on a day-to-day basis, just, working in the sector that I work in, how they can affect bigger picture items. And like, if you extrapolate to the idea of who we conceptualize society as being a domain of. For example, I'll give you a better example. When we envision the visually impaired as someone on the fringe of society, as someone who's a marginalized community, when we start building public transport, they're a community you don't even think of including in your development or modernization initiatives. I'll give you a more concrete example. So for example, Vizag is now the Visakhapatnam government, the government wants to modernize its bus fleet, and they're spending a lot of money doing it. And what they're doing is they're increasing the width of the bus and adding air conditionings. But this really doesn't address the fact that you're not making public transportation more inclusive. You're just changing it to make it comfortable for the people that it already is serving. So I think thinking about disability as a lived phenomenon and a product of how we talk about disability. So the more inclusive our language becomes, the more inclusive our spaces become, whether it is theaters having audio descriptions of how the movies are being played, or public transport where buses have audio announcements that are loud and clear of each station of the bus route. These are inclusive spaces that truly empower, in that we normalize empowerment. We normalize including them in mainstream society. So we have a lot of models that we talk about disability using, whether it be the rights-based, whether it be the social model, the health model. But I think above all, to condense it down, I really want to think about disability as a product of interactions. How I interact with the visually impaired not only determines what I think about them, but what they think about themselves. The more inclusive you are towards them, the more included they feel, and that very meaningfully and tangibly influences their sense of personhood, identity, and as a citizen of a society. So I really want to leave you with that thought, disability is something that's lived, it's changing. Someone with visual impairment is not the same person with visual impairment tomorrow if he has, for example, a very important, meaningful conversation with someone who's affirmed and validated a lot of self-identity, personhood, that their space of disability changes. That is, their perception of who they are as a visually impaired and their place in society can fundamentally change. So I really want to leave you with that thought as, I know all of you are invested in inclusion. So can you really include if inclusion isn't a lived phenomenon that happens every day in your conversations, your interactions, and how you come to define space? So that's what I wanted to end with. Again, this was sort of my webinar and I felt like I spoke a lot, but I do hope you were able to follow along and pick and choose what you thought was important and relevant, both in your organizations and your roles as citizens, but also as someone who's interested in working in this space. Again, I was generic and vague for a reason. Every specific topic I can spend half an hour talking to you about, but my aim in this webinar was to introduce you to the multiple positives that are ongoing in this space and the resources that you can reach out to again. So this is how I want to end with. Again, references and acknowledgements. I could not have done it without AIF or VisionAid. Manish, thank you so much for being you. Nirmala, she's my mentor. She has influenced me right from speaking my mind out to following things that I care about and I'm passionate about. So this is as much her baby as it was my baby. Chandni for being so supportive, the CFP group has just answered all my calls, messages, texts, which has been incredible, and the opportunity to be a Clinton Fellow, of course. And at VisionAid, see, this is a laundry list. I remember texting Ram and going, can I just say VisionAid Online Academy team and VisionAid Vizag team? But no, I actually want to take people's names. Ram for being flexible and an amazing mentor who's allowed me to experiment. Of course, VLN sir, who's always just there to check in and make sure I'm okay. Jayanti, you have had very incredible check-in calls with me that have made me think critically about what I am doing at VisionAid, what I can be doing at VisionAid. So really thank you for that. And, Ramesh sir, for just being such a happy, smiling face at VisionAid. It was a pleasure to come to work and see your face every day. Apurva and Anshuman, I've been having more and more conversations with you. Apurva, like your dedication to organization is inspiring. And Anshuman actually stayed up last night with me till 10:30 to help me organize my PowerPoint. So a huge shout out to him. And of course, the students, the community members that have informed all the perspectives that I have the privilege of saying that I do have today. This would not have been possible without all of those people and so much more. And the manual is from Hans Foundation, also a shout out to them. But yeah, I just think that, we talk so much about life skills and this is the I appreciate activity, because had I not appreciated them, I really think they needed to know how valuable they are to my experience in these past 10 months. So guys, embody life skills, not just learn about it. And now I sound like a teacher, but yeah, this is officially where I end my webinar. So please feel free to any comments, questions. I would love to talk more about specific theories, specific life skills courses. I've also left my information and VisionAid's information. So if you want more information or even access to specific kinds of documents, please feel free to send us an email.
Excellent talk, Pallavi. So let's take any questions. I know we're a little bit over time, but we can still take a few questions. So people can unmute themselves and ask questions or type it in the chat.
Ram, this is Nirmala here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm on Parmeshwar's laptop because my microphone isn't working.
Okay.
And so, but now my video doesn't work. So, but I just wanted to comment on Pallavi's webinar today. Pallavi, bravo. I really want to say that. Bravo. I'm so honored to be your mentor. In fact, your webinar, it took me back to the day when we were sitting in the interview at DC.
Oh my, Elsa, yeah.
And I thought to myself, here is a girl, who brings so much passion. She brings so much talent. And you also made us think right there on that day. And I thought, this is truly what embodies, how we define an AIF Clinton Fellow. So And the same passion, the same talent, and making us think, you brought it back again today to the webinar. So thank you so much and congratulations. I do want to also, and I do want to say that I'm so proud of you, and I'm feeling so good just listening to you today. I know we've
now you're
laughed
making me teary-eyed. Thank you.
But I do need to say the things I really need to know. I know we're going to remain lifelong friends, and we've had lots of fun and great conversations in this 10 months.
Yeah.
And, for me, the role as a mentor was so easy because you were motivated, so self-driven, and your sharp intellect at thinking of the world, at large was really, something that I admired in you. And so, and the best part of it was you pushed the envelope, you questioned the status quo, you offered so many different opinions, you talked about changing attitudes, you cared about gender, you cared about the visually impaired, and more important, you really cared about these STA scholars at the Vision Aid program. Each one of them was very special to you. So I'm so happy I was part of this whole journey across. And of course, I'm thankful to Vision Aid for giving me that opportunity and also to be with you throughout this process. So stay well, and we'll be there all the time as good friends.
Absolutely. And honestly, right back to you with everything you said. I mean, this just wouldn't have been possible without your support and love and guidance. So, cheers to lifelong friends. But yes.
Yeah.
Well
Thank
said.
you.
Yeah, well said on both ends. Yeah, thank you, Nirmala. You're amazing mentor. Thank you to all the AI folks for bringing a person like Pallavi into our team. It's been great having her. We enjoyed working with her, and our students enjoyed working with her. When the centers were open before COVID, I think a lot of the scholars were sitting with her every day, so it was a treat for them to work with Pallavi on many of these courses. So it's been an excellent journey, and I think this is a great way to celebrate the completion of the fellowship. So thanks to one and all. I just want to call on Mr. VL Narasimhan, who's the head of Vision Aid India. VL, if you want to say a few words before we...
Yes, certainly. Pallavi, when we started this AF fellowship exercise about last September, last August, so we interviewed about 5 fellows who are most likely to be selected out of that. And on Vision Aid side, I think if I remember right, we were about 5 people who wanted to brainstorm as to which fellow will be most ideal or suitable for the objectives we had in mind. And it was an unanimous decision that the fellow should be you. And I think that decision proved very right. And we are extremely happy that you could merge into the whole program objectives so well. Your interpersonal skills are very good. I echo what Ram has said. The students felt so comfortable interacting with you, taking your advice, sharing their concerns with them, as well as the staff. So the teaching staff, the administration staff, so all that. So thank you once again, and it has been a very, very happy journey and memorable. And let us not close 19th June as the cutoff. Okay, so we need to be continuously in touch. So yeah, so thank you once again, and thanks of course, to AAF to facilitate this. So they are the they need more credit for enabling this. Yeah.
Well said, VLN. Well said.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions from anyone?
Sir, excuse me.
Please go ahead.
I'm Raju here. Yes. So Pallavi ma'am, your explanation was tremendous. It was very good. So I have one question.
Yeah.
Can I ask?
Yeah, no, please.
Yeah. So actually, the education point of view, as you have spoken about the disability rights and all, but still some people are not able to join in the community, like normal community, normal schools like that.
Yeah.
They are still facing the discrimination. And
Yeah.
one more thing is the government is least bothered about all these things, like about architectural designing, or it might be about education, it might be about designing, it might be, they are least bothered about all these things,
Yeah.
because some people are there who are facing these kind of problems in their day-to-day life.
Yeah.
So yeah, currently can you tell me what is the solution for this, or what is the mandatory thing?
That's a very, very important point you bring up, right? Because I think, as I said, law is only a law on paper unless people actually start implementing it. So one of the biggest concerns has been across the board. The timeline has been given of 2022, and a lot of buildings are still not accessible. And I don't know if I have a solution for this, but I think I definitely can give you my thoughts about it. I think the reason we have a webinar like this is to raise awareness about these rights, right? So, knowing the fact that you have the right to go question whether it's the state commissioner appointed for dealing with the matters relating to people with disabilities, or raising awareness in your own local community that can become a voice of action, a voice where you put your demands out there. I think making people aware, both this involves people with disabilities, people without disabilities, and bringing people who are actually affected and passionate by this issue together by raising awareness, by teaching people and informing people of their rights, is one big step to making sure that nobody is deprived of something that is actually given to them by law, right? So that's something I would say is something I would start off with, at least making sure, I'm informing my community, engaging in very important conversations with them. And you can have discussions that involve important local, I want to say local figures. It can be nonprofit. It can be specific nonprofits working in the disability sector like Vision Aid. And, you can start reaching out to state, I would say there are a specific set of resources assigned for these issues. You can look them up and start reaching out to them. But I don't know if that's a solution. It is definitely a long-term change. This is something we're walking towards. So I think that would be the first step. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for asking.
Good question, and yeah, it's a difficult answer. It was well answered, Pallavi. I think I agree with you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, so I think you did such a good job that nobody has any more questions. So well done. Great job, and all the best, and we'll keep in touch between now and then. Yeah. So thank you all for joining.
Yeah.
Pallavi did a very nice
Thank
job,
you.
Pallavi, and thank you so much to the AIF team, Nirmala, Manish, and Chandni. Very nice job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, Pallavi.
Bye.